For decades, civil society organizations, activists, and environmentalists have played an important role in challenging governments and industry, representing marginalized groups, and championing the environment. These grassroots organizations include passionate volunteers who have developed an in-depth knowledge of the issues. We don't always agree, but we recognize the importance of their experience and the passion that they bring to the subject. We welcome all such groups to participate in the development of the integrated strategy for radioactive waste, both at this summit and in the months ahead as we continue to engage with Canadians and Indigenous peoples. Today, we're pleased to welcome a diverse panel of distinguished guests, chaired by Tom Adams, a longtime activist in the nuclear area in Ontario and in Canada. He is a former executive director of Energy Probe, a non-governmental organization focused on conservation and sustainability. He specialized in environmental and economic analysis of the energy sector. Make sure you enter your questions in the Engage tab, and we've set aside time for questions and answers at the end of the panel. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Corinne. We have a very interesting panel to present today with representation from across this wonderful country, from sea to shining sea, from one end of the country to the other. Our first speaker is Mandy Bala. She's a Master's of Science student in Public Health at University of Waterloo. Among her affiliations, Manvi is a president and co-founder of an organization, Shake Up the Establishment, a volunteer-based organization promoting climate justice through awareness campaigns, educational resources, community engagement, and political engagement. Over to you, Manvi.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Manvi. My pronouns are she and her. I just, I have a few minutes here to kind of occupy some space and share some thoughts. And I'm going to do that in the realm of environmental racism, as that's, I think, the area that and public health and kind of in the intersections between communities and health and this issue. In preparation for this event, I did my research, and I am well versed in environmental racism. I guest lecture on it, but I would say that nuclear storage wasn't something that immediately comes to mind, or nuclear strategy planning to do with energy. It is something that comes to mind when you get into it. When you first think of environmental racism, in my context, I think of a lot of the time when I guest lecture, I talk about the First Nations drinking crisis, the water crisis. I talk about Maawandoon First Nation and proximity to toxic chemical plants and stuff like that. And so it's really interesting how a lot of the time we actually don't put a spotlight on the nuclear conversation that we're having today. Kind of an interesting way that I said that, nuclear conversation, but it is a really, really important conversation that I don't think enough young people are engaging in. So I'm really thankful to be here today and to have been given the opportunity to learn from my fellow panelists and be a part of the discussion. But I did do my research, and I have kind of looked into this situation, and I had a couple thoughts that I would love to share, in particular, as I mentioned, centering communities. So to kick it off, I do want to quote Robert Bullard, who is the father of environmental justice. And I just want to start off with this because I think it centers a lot of the work that I do and kind of where my values come from. But he says, the environmental justice that we developed in 1991 is that people who are most impacted must speak for themselves and must be in these rooms when decisions are being made about their self-determination, their communities, and their livelihood. They must be in the room. And so it's interesting in choosing to be here today. It wasn't, I think, Tom, you would circulate it as well. There was a letter from fellow organizations that I really do respect, who weren't engaging in conversations. And it was a decision that I made consciously to be a part of it, because I do feel that we do need to have that transparency and that accountability, and those conversations lead us to develop more informed strategies. And another thing that really led me to being here today, and this is important to, I think, the story and the ethos of what's going to be happening in our panel, is I was looking and I read Saugeen and Ojibwe Nation had put out a statement on NWMO, and they had said, after many years of hard work, we finally have a commitment from the NWMO that they will not select a site for Canada's used fuel in our territory without our consent. We now have the space and time to have full conversation about nuclear issues. And they continue to say that there's going to be an ongoing community process and continued discussion, which made me feel like, okay, I think that we're at a point now where we're having conversations and it's going to be productive. So I come into this space with an open mind that we're able to center communities and that the people in the room are able to actually have a say in forming the strategy. So I just kind of wanted to frame that a little bit before I kind of just take another minute. I think, I don't know how long I really have, but another minute or two just to talk about how important and the places where I see the guiding values and principles in this strategy development, where I think the most important components are. So for me, actually yesterday I was a facilitator as well, and I became quite acquainted with the guiding principles that are going into place in forming these strategies. And so I would say, in having conversations with fellow community members yesterday and having done the research in this area, I've come to kind of see that the biggest things for me personally would continue to be transparency and accountability, I think, and centering the community, the host communities, the communities near neighboring communities, the people who will be using, for example, the water sources. Water was a huge thing that came up, and I think it's interesting how water connects us all. It's not like you have to be directly adjacent to be impacted by if the water is affected, a lot more people are affected than just the people who are situated directly next to facilities, and the ground and everything, encompassed within the environment there. So I just want to say that I think for me, and speaking from Shake Up the Establishment and some of the work we do, we really do center communities and evidence. And in those, with those considerations in mind, I would say that the guiding principles that are most important would be those. And then I think I'll just mention one or two quick more things before I pass the mic back to Tom, because I don't really want to go on and on, but I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists, as I mentioned, and the Q&A. But something that my colleague and mentor, someone I really look up to, who is a leading voice in environmental racism, is Dr. Ingrid Waldron. And she says, this is something that I put into my guest lectures all the time, which is it's not only about health and stress, it's also about lack of power. You've placed certain industries in certain communities without consulting them. You've taken away their voice. And that's not something we want to have happen. That is the opposite. That is like the antithesis of what these conversations should be doing. So I'm really hoping that by choosing to participate in these discussions that we build trust, and that we are able to continue building a co-designed, like an ethical co-designed strategy to deal with this urgent issue, because we already have the waste, we need to deal with it. And we also need to move forward in a way that's sustainable in the long term, because of course this issue, it's not going away until we deal with it. It is, and we deal with it in a way that makes sense for communities. And my last thing that I'll say is, because I am a public health researcher and my field is actually in behavioral science and to do with risk perception within the climate justice sector, and this transcends into environmental racism, and honestly it transcends into almost all environmentalist issues that I'm aware of, and general decision making in general with public health. But studies have found that white cis men do not perceive risk the same way as Indigenous women, as women of color, as those with disabilities, as there's so many different intersections of identity that are necessary to be represented at decision-making tables, because the very perception of risk for what could happen is different. And this has been found in numerous studies across numerous issues. And so, not that you need evidence to justify representation, but if there ever needed to be justification, that is the very minimum. If people are worried about these and they have very valid concerns, they need to be heard. And that can only be done if we have a diverse representation at the table, and that ensuring that the urgency is not minimized. And I think also the intersections of identity can offer such unique viewpoints that might not be present otherwise. So I can't emphasize enough that I'm thankful to be on this panel. I only speak speak for myself, but I'm grateful to be here and be able to offer whatever I can. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the fellow panelists. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker comes to us from the Salish Nation. Chief Ian Campbell is a hereditary chief and a politician, currently serving his 4th term in elected office with the Salish Nation. Squamish Nation, excuse me. Representing Squamish Nation, he has been involved in the creation of conservancies, the acquisition of tree farm license and fee simple lands, numerous protocol agreements with neighboring First Nations and other governments, and numerous energy projects as well, including the very innovative wood fiber LNG project scheduled to start construction perhaps later this year. Over to you, Chief Campbell.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody. So Neta and Cholak, my ancestral name is Cholak. Sukyo Siam Kwashamin, my chieftain name is Sukyo. I'm really happy to share a little bit of our story from the Squamish Nation, where, I'm the first generation out of residential schools in my family. So, I was fortunate to be raised by my grandparents who immersed me in our language and brought us out on the land from a young age. And that really shaped my my career in rights and title as a negotiator, interfacing with all levels of government. My first task when I came into the nation in '99 as an employee was land use planning, where it was important for us to protect 50,000 hectares of our territory, comprising about 8% of Squamish territory. We never had legal recourse during my parents' era when mass industrial projects were being established on the West Coast. So it took generations of effort to finally get to the point where we were able to start protecting lands that are sacred to us, but also designating areas that are conducive for industrial projects and for development. So we got involved in, as you mentioned, forestry and ski hill development, a lot of fee simple land development. And this obviously interfaced with a lot of our neighboring First Nations, which rose to conflicts around consultation. How do you garner consent under free, prior, informed consent? We had to remove that ambiguity by moving from a place of competition over scarcity resources to collaboration. And that really allowed us to then bolster, projects like LNG, where we were able to conduct our own independent environmental assessment, to then look at issuing 25 legally binding conditions to the proponents to ensure that in order to garner consent from the Squamish Nation, it meets our metrics. So in this whole discussion with nuclear waste, I feel there are a lot of parallels in, collaboration amongst First Nations to look at, the principles that identify engagement with First Nations, not just consulting, but seeking consent within our territories on what types of activities can occur and where. I think that also leads to environmental stewardship is paramount to all of our minds, but how we actualize that in recognizing First Nations as a government is very important because that's something under the Indian Act that was systemically denied to Indigenous peoples through the history of Canada. So it's an opportunity to mature as a society to then move forward and bring all those voices into the fold. So I'm excited by the prospect of us moving forward in a way that creates the triple bottom line: the environmental, the social, and the economic stimulus that will sustain our peoples for perpetuity. I think, for us, we had to look at environmental conditions first before we talked about economic opportunities and procurement. And that meets our metrics, it meets our values. It removes the ambiguity of what vision we have for our future and the management of our lands and resources. That must entail cultural and spiritual values, because we recognize Western society has largely removed cultural and spiritual values from their vocabulary when it comes to management of natural resources. So that balance of Indigenous epistemologies along with Western management regimes, I think, is important for Canada to consider as we move forward. And I was happy to see some of those reflected in the 11 principles. So I can go on a lot more, but certainly happy to be here and listen to my fellow panelists. So thank you, Tom.
Very interesting. Thank you. In the introduction, Corinne spoke about the experience and passion of environmental organizations. Our next speaker, Anne Coxworth, also brings a scientific perspective. She has a background in nuclear chemistry from UC Berkeley. She has been a volunteer researcher with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society for decades, where she's worked on environmental impact reviews, energy planning processes, with a special emphasis on the uranium mining industry, but also in electricity, energy options and planning and radioactive waste management. Anne was a member of the Scenarios Task Group that was set up in the early days of the NWMO to look at the very long-term issues that needed to be considered in planning for high-level waste management. Anne, please.
And I'll try to keep this to 4 minutes. The Saskatchewan Environmental Society has been involved in nuclear issues since the 1970s. We've, as an organization, participated in the early panel discussions on uranium development. We've intervened in many nuclear safety commission hearings. We were active in discussions about the early AECL disposal concept for high-level wastes, and in consultations about potential high-level waste disposal sites. So the management of nuclear waste has been a major concern of ours for several decades. I just want to touch briefly on 3 issues. First of all, the non-participation in this current process by most of the environmental groups that have worked on nuclear issues. The major reason I understand that they're not participating is a distrust of the NWMO and a reluctance to being seen as being used to greenwash the process. And given the preponderance of nuclear waste generators on the board of the NWMO, it's perceived by many environmental groups as a tool of the industry rather than as a public policy institution. So absent today are the voices of most of the groups that have been working on these issues for decades and have developed a great deal of expertise on the issues. And I think this leaves a big gap in our discussions. And I cannot speak for all the other groups, partly because we don't always agree on everything. Secondly, I would say that contributing to the mistrust of the industry is what is really a decades-long history of what have turned out to be really bad decisions about waste management, decisions by the nuclear industry. So we can look at sites like Hanford in the state of Washington, at Sellafield in the north of England, at the Gunner and Beaver Lodge sites in northern Saskatchewan, at Port Hope in southern Ontario. All of these are problem waste sites that are really almost impossible to fully remediate, and that will involve huge public expenditures in the effort to remediate them. So this really does not lead to a sense of confidence in the leadership that's been provided in the past by the nuclear industry. And thirdly, yesterday we heard a futurist talk about possible scenarios for the next 10,000 years. And this takes me back to the Scenarios project that Tom referred to in the introduction. This was a project conducted by the NWMO almost 20 years ago, and I don't know if anybody besides me remembers it, but it involved a group of us from a variety of backgrounds who met for a series of workshops over a 2-year period to consider what kinds of issues need to be taken into account given the huge range of uncertainties about the future. Uncertainties about politics and governance and war and peace and environmental change and technological development, all of those things that Leah spoke about yesterday. And at that time, that process led us to the conclusion that we cannot rely on people in some unknown future to look after maintenance tasks for us. And that is actually why I find myself in disagreement with many of my friends in other environmental groups, friends who favor the concept of what is called rolling stewardship. However, although I disagree with them about this, I think their perspective really needs to be heard because, there are certainly good arguments in favor of it. So finally, I'd make 3 quick suggestions. First of all, it would be unwise to rely on people in the distant future to do maintenance for us. Secondly, it would be wise to hold off creating more nuclear wastes until we've actually got solutions in place for the waste problems that we're already dealing with. And thirdly, I think it would be helpful to make some changes to the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's governance so that it would be seen as representing the interests of the Canadian public rather than those of the industry that has created the waste problem. I think this kind of change could go a long way to building trust. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne, for those engaging comments. Our next speaker comes to us via Starlink from Northwestern Ontario. Darren Harper is a member of the Red Sucker Lake First Nation and co-founder of Maawandoon. Help me with the pronunciation if I messed it up, and also the firm Carbonex. Maawandoon is a firm that draws its name from a traditional Ojibwe term meaning bringing us together, and works with resource projects on Indigenous community engagement. Carbonex is an Indigenous-led technology company focused on activated carbon using sustainably sourced feedstocks. Mr. Harper, you have the floor.
Great. Thanks very much, Ian. Bonjour. Good morning. Mijikibanas, Nindajnakaz, Makwa Dotem. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the creator for being here today and this morning, and really for bringing us together, especially to my fellow panel members. And I've introduced myself in my language as it is important in my culture to do so, and introduce myself in that way. It's disrespectful not to. These are things that I've been taught. It's a protocol. We understand that all of our cultures have protocols, we have ceremonies, and it's important to respect them. And that's part of building any trustful relationship. So for this morning, I just wanted to focus my conversation around the inclusion of Indigenous participation, partnerships, and ultimately bringing trustworthy and respectful relationships together. For so long, proponents engage, consult with Indigenous communities and organizations and groups on their projects. And this is a rigorous and, quite frankly, a tense process and conversation. So historically, governments through treaties miss this and have yet to be honored. Indigenous peoples in our treaty relations view those treaties as being sacred, very sacred, and they're binding, and the government has not fulfilled the treaty obligations, the land questions, revenue sharing. So in part of that, we have rights to education and health, and those benefits would accrue from the land and resource that we shared with the government. We know that the federal government receives these royalties and revenues generated from these resources, such as forestry, mining, energy, oil and gas. They generate billions of dollars, and they have the monies to meet these treaty obligations. So there is a disconnect there and trust. But when we talk about partnerships and developing respectful relationships, this historical impact that treaties have had gives us some self-doubt when proponents come to the table and want to develop a partnership and want to develop a project. So really the trust isn't there. And, I believe that if true relationships are going to happen, and that the development of a relationship is done together openly and respectfully, there will be potential to develop successful economic opportunities together for everyone. So just sort of a question: why is it that we get brought as Indigenous people into a project when the project has already been considered or developed? And part of that is they need to consult. So stepping back from that, why not bring us in as partners to discuss the potential of a project? Bring us in on the conceptual stage of it, the idea. And what I mean by that is, true partnerships and Indigenous partners can provide true benefits to projects, including traditional knowledge, the current use of their territory, land users, bringing in elders and youth and women and men into these discussions. And it's very important that we have that balance of that. And what the other part that we do is we're storytellers. And as Indigenous people, Western science is disconnected from what I call Indigenous science. And right now I'm working on sort of, in the projects I'm on, is really bringing those two concepts together. Science has a definition of a rock. We have a definition of a rock because we view everything as spiritual. And so this can all lead to potential support and through relationship and development, as long as it's respectful, that it's safe, that it's secure, and that it's environmentally sustainable. And it's just a start. So the inclusion of Indigenous partnerships as true partners from the beginning is the starting point. And Indigenous people have a connection to the land, and that land and the things around it make up that spiritual connection, as I shared. And that's why it's so important. So over the past 2 years, as an example, I had the opportunity to facilitate some discussions with Indigenous groups, organizations, communities, and the Métis on a public attitudes research project on NWMO's draft transportation framework. Now, this was just discussion, so we met with many Indigenous communities and Métis organizations from the province and had an overwhelming amount of information and feedback and conversation and a starting point of a partnership that looked at educating first and not consulting. So in a sense, they're developing that relationship was the starting point. In my opinion, I believe that the rest of the industry in this country needs to start doing the same and start to lead by example. Investing at the front end is key to success in any project, and that the key to success is to have Indigenous partners, a partner or partners as a collaborative. And I've seen that over the last 3-4 years. But industry and government need to say yes to this as well, and be more meaningful in that way. This provides a better balance. Otherwise, we're all going to fail collectively. It's just not going to happen. So, but this is how we achieve certain agreements. This is how we achieve a truly a mutual benefit and partnership to everyone and relationship. That is how we all become prosperous, when we provide the utmost respect to one another. And I believe this is a goal we can achieve through hard work and through collaboration, and it's in our reach. And I'll just close off by saying, what can we do? And I have just 3 simple points around that, and it's share and be open. Listen, show respect, not just for the people, but for the land. And don't just set targets, specify, and really be honest. So I'd like to thank you this morning for listening. Gigawa min minawa for spending this very nice morning with me.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker on the list before we turn to questions, we have with us Mo Phùng. Mo is a marine biologist, an ocean technologist, visual artist, and underwater photographer based in Nova Scotia. They engage with the ocean and environmental sectors to create climate justice frameworks and prioritize racialized voices and relationships. Mo currently works with future Ancestor services, the civic leadership group, The Platform, and is the co-founder of Oceans Week Halifax. Over to you, Mo. I think we've got an audio situation. Just
mute.
Gotcha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mo. My pronouns are they and she. I'm really excited to kind of have this conversation, and I'll totally keep it short so we can get into some of these questions that are rolling in. But the main focus of my work here and why I'm here today in this conversation is around the lens of equity, anti-racism, and climate justice. And it's building off what everyone else has said, and especially Manvi and Darren, where my main focus is and what I am passionate about the most is the trust aspect, the accountability aspect, and the transparency aspect. And so I want to have more conversations about the impacts on the people, the marginalized communities who are living near these potential and proposed sites for disposal, and all the waterways and how all of these waterways that we know lead to the ocean. And we need to have these processes in the conversation and not let those be kind of outliers or afterthoughts. And my work with Oceans Week Halifax was to bridge the gap between industry organizations and community organizations, and bring those groups together to have conversations and be transparent in the work that they're doing. Bring together kind of a broader demographic of folks who are working in ocean technology and conservation and education. And so I think that's important, and why this panel is here today is to kind of be transparent in these relationship building opportunities, having young folks, older folks, all ages, abilities, genders, and backgrounds. And that's why we're all here today. And I'm excited to have this conversation and dive into these questions. And so I'll wrap it up and we can get on with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's just wonderful. We have some questions from the audience, and the first one, I'll invite Anne to participate. I have some comments myself, but and the question arises: what would it take to bring some of these environmental groups with long-standing interests and concerns and expertise on the topics at hand, the low, intermediate waste, the high level waste, the integration of these planning systems. What would it take to bring these groups to the table? Do you have some suggestions on how to broaden the conversation?
Yeah, I do. I think it's interesting that those groups are actively participating in almost a parallel process, which is being run by Natural Resources Canada. You know, we had a very brief presentation yesterday from NRCan, and I've been puzzled actually by, you know, these two processes that are going on seemingly in parallel, talking about the same issues. So the groups feel comfortable, more comfortable, talking to a group which represents government rather than industry. We all participate in processes led by the Nuclear Safety Commission. Similarly, you know, that is perceived as being more independent of the industry. And I think it was interesting that when the first draft agenda for this meeting came out, and we looked at what was the goal for this panel, and I think the wording was, the goal was to demonstrate the active engagement of a multiplicity of voices early in the process. So it was almost as though the NWMO just wants to show that, okay, we've talked to you guys, rather than we want to hear your perspective and incorporate it into the decision making. So I think it has to be to bring people into the discussion. It has to be led by an agency that is perceived as being more independent of the interests of the industry.
I can't resist throwing in some comments of my own on this point. I really think it's unfortunate that we haven't got a broader conversation, but conversations evolve, and that's understandable. The independence of the decision-making process around waste management is something near and dear to my heart. If you look at the history of even the CNSC, for example, you know, it wasn't that many years ago during the Stephen Harper years that the CNSC lost the leadership of Linda Keane in a situation that was, you know, clearly a violation of the independence of that organization. And so, like, the necessity for the NWMO to separate itself and distinguish itself and be able to speak clearly, you know, about the waste issues, without the perception and reality of its the profound relationship that it's got with the guidance of the waste generators, I think that's critical in the long term. Our next question, I want to turn to our younger panelists. You know, I've got too much gray hair to really contribute on this, but how do we get more young people involved in the conversation? Manvi and Mo, you give us some help here.
Mo, you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I just have one kind of thing that just came to my brain. Is having us in this conversation is really great, and I really appreciate and I'm honored to be on this panel, but I find a lot of the time is organizations and industry invite youth into their already made structure format of what they want to happen, and they have their own goals set of what they want to accomplish with just our kind of involvement and presence. But I think having youth lead what that format looks like, what those goals can be, and have a more collaborative process would change a lot of things and bring new perspectives that lie outside of those constructs. I don't know what you think, Manvi, and I know that you're like a leader in your field, and so I just feel like when you're given the opportunity to lead, you feel more free to really make some change.
Yeah, I can't emphasize this enough. I think that we just need to be given more power. People don't trust us. They think that we're stupid or something. But we're very, very intelligent. I'm only 23. I'm very capable. And outside of institutional education, just like Mo, we're intelligent young leaders. And I think that when we're given the agency and the opportunity to occupy space and lead with because we're centering our futures, right? And everyone's futures. And in that way, I think we really are the people that are the best people you can entrust to be able to give some opinion, have some part, some agency in co-designing these strategies, because we're centering our sustainable, equitable, just long-term futures. And so we have that futuristic view. We also have the view that we want to have healthy, long lives. And I think that incorporating our viewpoints would, like Mo said, in the planning process is probably the best way. But if we're already at a point now where there are existing structures we have to work within certain frameworks, then I would say that the best path forward would be to, as soon as you possibly can, begin to involve us more and giving us more real estate and giving us a stake. I think if there were opportunities, I actually had the opportunity to talk to my note taker yesterday. Was shout out to Robert. He's great. He took notes during our facilitation session, and he's a young nuclear engineer. I don't want to get the degree wrong, something in that realm. And he taught me so much. Like, I already kind of knew what was going on. I have a background in biomedical science, so I understand like the endocrine side, the immunology, like I understand the human health side, but we were talking about the physics of it all. And he's so intelligent. And so if more young people can be given opportunities to speak about their ideas, I asked him frankly, I was like, what do you think about this issue? He had so much to say, but I've never heard a young person other than him, honestly, being given some real estate in these sessions to talk about it. So, yeah.
The next question, maybe I can turn to Chief Campbell and Darren to reflect on this. The metrics that the Squamish Nation has been using, and Darren, with the resource projects you've been involved with, can you just give us a snapshot of the metrics that might have some kind of cross relevance to the challenges that NWMO faces here?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll try and be really brief. Really, our metrics stem from 2 or 3 years of intensive consultation with our membership, where there was high anxiety around new industrial projects in our territory. So we had to really go into deep listening to what the concerns were around seawater cooling, for example, going into Howe Sound with the revitalization of herring biomass and salmon rearing. This was a huge concern after decades of absence of cetaceans in our waters due to industrial projects. We wanted to see the revitalization of our environment. So how do you pair that with a new industrial project? We had to mitigate, and move from seawater cooling to air cooling, for example. We had to avoid the Squamish River estuary, which is critical habitat, to do directional drilling. We had to listen to our members' concerns around compressor stations in proximity to inhabited reserves, to make sure we move compressor stations into more backcountry areas to diffuse the issue of explosion, which probability is low but consequence is high. We had to then get into management planning for the life of the project, to be a regulator, to put on not only our economic hat with procurement, but our government hat to then have ongoing concern of oversight of the operations of shipping within the Salish Sea, the penstock that delivers the product to the facility, and all the other related value chains. So those metrics really built in ongoing oversight. So we put ourselves in a position as a regulator versus a stakeholder, and that gave us significant leverage and legal recourse to protect our interests. Thanks.
Darren.
Yeah, no, I think the Chief Campbell hit the nail on the head in that regard and explained it quite well. So in the work that I do and the projects that I've brought into, it's always been reactive. because they're coming to you with a project. And so now you're playing catch up on the education piece of what that project is and the implications and the impacts that it could have in your territory. So we work a lot now on trying to get caught up and educating because, you know, leadership is having the in-depth conversations, but you got to get that conversation to the people and the elders and the land users and everyone that makes up the community. You know, it's a holistic approach. And so when we talk about youth, you know, in the projects I'm working on and some of the things that we're negotiating, youth is part of it from the beginning. Because the project may not happen that year. You may be 10 years out, and those youth that are involved now are going to have a different mindset 10 years from now. And the elders who are around at that time may not be around then. So there is a sense and an urgency of capturing that knowledge. There is a sense of urgency of the protection of your homelands. Lakes and rivers and streams and everything is all connected. The animals and the trees and you know your natural surroundings, they're all connected. You know, we still use the land. We still are very active on it, whether it's for traditional land use or current land use or spiritually using it has an impact. So when you disturb that and you alter it, it can never go back to what it used to be, and that is very, very important that we are a part of that from concept, not in the middle part of the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. We are going to have to draw it to a close, but I really appreciate it. If I could add my clap, I think it's you all deserve a round of applause. Thanks so much.
Thank you.